All right. I think we are ready to start this panel. We chose the topic of public-private partnerships because that is a delightful mantra. But really what we want to talk about today is how change happens. So last year at SciCon, it was a senior military leader who was talking about the domain of cyberspace, the warfighting domain, and this problem that there were all these pesky civilians in his warfighting domain. Someone from the Department of Commerce, I think it's very important that we regularly and frequently remember that cyberspace, pretty much all of it, is built, maintained, inhabited, and completely dependent on the private sector, and meanwhile the private sector is completely dependent on it. And so we want to talk about what that role is, and more importantly, how we secure it. So we have a fantastic panel today. I'm not going to read the full bios because we have truly leadership. We should also really hope that there's not a cybersecurity incident in the next hour and 15 minutes because we have some of the people who are responsible for dealing with this in the financial sector, in the power sector, in the automotive sector, to handle these things globally. But we're going to sort of find out a little more about how they do that. So starting at the end, we have Chris Button, who's the executive director for JPMorgan Chase's Global Cyber Partnerships and Government Strategy team. Before joining JPMC, he was at DHS and spent a lot of time in their cyber threat analysis division. And of course, he is a former Coastie, spending 24 years leaving the Coast Guard as a lieutenant commander. Next to him is Kevin Perkins, the new vice president and CISO of Exelon, the nation's leading competitive energy provider, as well as the provider of electricity to this room. So if the lights go off, we can blame, depending on how you view responsibility, either arbitrary nation state or Exelon. And we'll dive into that particular question. Before joining Exelon, he was at the FBI, capping off his 31 years of experience as the Associate Deputy Director and the COO, basically the guy who did all the work to make sure the Bureau could do its job protecting us.
Don't argue that.
No, it's all good.
Next to Kevin is Siobhan. Siobhan McDermott leads the Global Cyber Public Policy team at Bank of America. She's responsible for BofA's participation in programs around the world for resiliency for the global financial system. And she's been at Bank of America since 2016. She's at Ernst & Young and formerly a CISO for Utilidata. She's also actively engaged in the policy research community. She's worked with the Geneva Center for Security Policy. She's worked at the Fletcher School, and she's on the board for the Center for Global Risk and Security at RAND, and the author of many more books than I've written. So that's fantastic. And finally, we have Jeff Massimilla, who is the recently named Vice President for Global Vehicle Safety and Cybersecurity. He's formerly the head of product cybersecurity, and GM has folded that. I think it's a real indication of how GM treats cybersecurity. They see this as a critical part of overall vehicle safety. So just protecting everyone that is in their cars, cybersecurity is now a key example of that. And Jeff's been at GM since 2001, starting as an engineer and working his way across the organization in a variety of roles, including the infotainment system, which has zero security consequences and risks for the modern system. So we have a fantastic panel, but I wanted to say a few words about the impetus for this. And I've been thinking about this issue in particular. I'm at the Department of Commerce. I run the multi-stakeholder initiatives on cybersecurity at NTIA. And someone a few months ago said, Alan does work in public-private partnerships. And I took offense. I said, no, I'm useful. Because I think, at best, we've become a little jaded about this term. And at worst, we're outright skeptical. That we've used this as a mantra without really unpacking what does it mean. And what are the respective responsibilities of the government and the private sector? Because there are two very real trends. The first one I think we're all familiar with, which is there are real security challenges, right? Yesterday and today, we've had fantastic keynotes detailing what these risks are. Vince Cerf said, hey, the IT industry, the software that we're using is vulnerable, and we need to really rethink how we can have a more secure foundation. So there are giant challenges for securing the digital ecosystem. At the same time, we recognize that government should not be telling people what to do. And this isn't just a political slogan. I think even people who are personally comfortable with a regulatory role would say, well, suppose we were to give someone the unilateral authority, what would they do? What would the answer be? What is a one-size-fits-all approach? And I think we'd all be very skeptical that there is something that we can do. So if there are real challenges, and it is not up to the government to fix it, the civilian government, and we sort of believe in Title X, say, we're going to not have the government, the military fix everything, what's the option? What is left? And what has to happen is leadership from the private sector that makes and maintains all of these systems that we're all dependent on, that runs the economy. And government can play a role. And we're going to talk today about what that role looks like. So I want to start off. We have finance, we have automotive, we have energy. So let's talk with some of the good news. What's working? How, if you were to say, what is an example of where industry leadership, perhaps with some government encouragement, is making a real difference in security today? Can we just go down the line and have an example? Jeff, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Alan, and to the SciCon conference organizers here for a chance to have General Motors represent ourselves here today. I think one example that's working, and I know we aren't going to talk about information sharing a lot, and that I think that's the wrong, that's not the right thing to focus on here, but it started based on that. So the automotive industry was able to set up an automotive ISAC here, and so we got the information sharing aspect started. But what that allowed us to do was work together. We're in a highly competitive industry. I think everybody's in a highly competitive industry, but I'd argue the automotive industry is uber competitive, and no pun intended on Uber there. We are very competitive, and therefore we don't collaborate very often. That being said, we had the opportunity through the ISAC to really set up a best practices effort that didn't exist before in our industry, and I would actually argue, based on what we've seen, there wasn't really a comprehensive best practices effort in any industry that then was willing to share their best practices widely as they were completed. So that ISAC allowed us to get together, get in the room, work with not just the best of the automotive industry, but bring in other sectors to some extent, standards organizations, NIST, and even worked very collaboratively with our regulator, NHTSA and DOT, to work through development of best practices that apply to our industry, but then also I think we can share, and hopefully it helps other industries as well.
And just to push a little strong on that,
Yeah.
It is wonderful to have a catalog of best practices.
Right.
There's a famous quote which is, no, ignore the Geiger counter. This nuclear plant follows best practices.
Safe.
How are these being used?
So I mean, I can speak for General Motors.
Yes.
General Motors has said unequivocally, we will adopt every best practice that's being written. And what that means is, and it's interesting because we have a dynamic in that environment where you can imagine there's varying levels of maturity. Different companies have varying levels of maturity in the area of cybersecurity. As you start to write best practices, there's a tendency, or could be a tendency by less mature entities to go, ooh, that one's really hard, so we probably shouldn't capture that one in the best practice, because if we do, then we actually have to do it. The great thing is, when you get a group that big together and the right cyber-minded people together, it doesn't matter if it's really hard. What it is a call to action to solve it. So we got to work with our partners. We got to work with partners outside of our industry to figure out how to meet that best practice. So my organization has stood up. Every best practice that's written, we assess ourselves immediately to that best practice. We use third parties and internal capability to do that. And then we create an action plan to say, where's our deficiencies? Where's our stretch? And then go off and create a plan to make sure that we're meeting all of them. And again, different entities in the auto industry, at different level of maturity, I'm sure they're doing different things, but I can speak to ours.
Fantastic. Siobhan?
So in financial services, we have something similar with the FS-ISAC that shares amongst about 7,500 banks and financial institutions in the U.S. information. Last year, a little over a year ago, the 8 systemically important banks in the United States stood up what is called the FSARC. So we're going to throw acronyms at you, the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resiliency Center. Say that 5 times quickly. And I would say, I might push a little bit on this was a discussion of setting this up in, either in spite or with the government in terms of collaboration. So it was originally the 8 big banks, 8 different entities from the government that came together. And as you can imagine, if you think, corralling 8 banks to do something collaboratively, try 8 different entities of the government on top of that. It was a very long approval process for one press release. But anyway, getting to the point of information sharing and actually looking at analysis on these different types of events that we're seeing. There's a couple of lessons learned that I think we walked away from. Some entities in the government are easier to work with than others in the private sector. Some are more difficult. And then when you look at, just the notion, this is only in the U.S. Once you look at going outside of the borders of the United States, it gets, very, very complicated very, very quickly. What we looked at is we decided to look at the systemic risk to the entire sector. Right? So this is not about any one individual institution. And to your point about collaboration, I think we're probably a lot further down that collaboration framework because realizing that an attack on one has a direct knock-on effect to all of us. So we started looking at different areas and addressing systemic risks. So we took wholesale payments, for example, and said, okay, across the board, if 3 banks go down, what happens? Who takes that volume? How do you make sure that the financial networks don't crash? How do you make sure liquidity gets out of the market? How do you make sure bills get paid? And how do you make sure that the money keeps moving? And so we were looking at that, directly with those systems, and we'll go beyond that to other systems. There's also an information sharing aspect to this, which gets also incredibly difficult as you start crossing borders. And then there's elements of, understanding how best to work with which government partners and how, we have, just from a model perspective, there are employees of the FSARC. There are bank secondees who understand complex global financial networks that are seconded into the FSARC. And then there are government folks also in there. So everybody's working in this sort of collaborative center together, which was a little bit different. And on the industry sharing piece of that, what we do at the end of the day, the products that come out of this get shared back through FS-ISAC to all the other banks, right, and the other financial institutions. We're also starting to look at power and utility, telco, and financial services together in creating, moving this sort of model to that next generation to be able to look at where the systemic risk, because I think you said when we were getting mic'd up, if the power goes out, the ATMs go down. Right, so that we're all dependent on each other. So how do we make sure that that all works?
So I want to drill down on the information sharing side of things, because that is often one of those things that we'll talk about. Just for the folks in the room, how does sharing information lead to better security?
Well, there's a couple of things, right? So if you look at, you have 8 organizations that represent, or different organizations. One organization might see an attack sooner than the others, and we can then share that information with the other organizations, or even more broadly throughout the sector to say, hey, we're seeing this abnormal traffic, we're seeing something going on over here, you guys keep an eye out for it. We look at this in the context of geopolitical risk. So every time the US government puts sanctions on a country, we start to see activity. We're getting to be a good barometer for that. But you start to get to some notion of potential predictability in that you can start to look at these big events that might cause repercussions, and then how do you share that information to make sure that the entire sector is protected and it's not just one institution that's protected over the others.
All right. Kevin, any thoughts on what's working?
Yes, and I will preface my comments as I told my other panelists here. I've been in this seat, the seat at Exelon, for about 3 weeks as Chief Security Officer. So early on, within the first day, I was told you need to learn about this thing known as the ESCC, the Electric Subsector Coordinating Council. And after my time in the FBI, I looked upon that for just a second with a bit of hesitation and a pause. You see, I grew up in the Bureau and was mentored under a guy named Bob Mueller. He's a guy who has about that much patience for anything that has the word steering committee, coordinating council, or anything else in it. Get the job done, get it done right now, and move on. And so as soon as I see this, I'm thinking, oh boy, here we go. And then I find out, well, my CEO is a big supporter of this. So, okay, now I do have to pay attention to this thing called the ESCC. But what I learned was this, and this is why I see it as really a success. ESCC is a group of CEOs, principals only, from across the industry that get together on a regular basis. They have regular do-outs. And if you want something done in any big bureaucracy, let the boss be part of it. Because at the Bureau, when Bob Mueller came in 1 week before 9/11, I sat in the morning briefs with him shortly after that, and you had briefer after briefer come in and talk about, he would ask a question, and he said, sir, we have a group studying that right now, and that would be the last time you saw that briefer. That was the end of it. He wanted action. And so as we look at what the ESCC is doing, its components, it's made up of principals. It's the CEOs. It's the men and women running this industry who say, do this and do it now, and it happens. Case in point, what we're looking at now is cyber mutual assistance. Kind of a novel concept when you think about it. So across the electric industry, and again, this is all, I'm learning this as we go along, you have great big Fortune 100 companies like Exelon, and you have everything from there on down to the mom and pop electric co-op. I grew up in a little town called Mountain Home, Arkansas. And we had Arkansas Power and Light, and we had the North Arkansas Electric Co-op. So what happens when the North Arkansas Electric Co-op gets hit? And a tornado runs through town, knocks down poles. Every power company from 3 states around will be down there and get everybody up and running, no time at all, and it's all good, mutual assistance. What a neat idea on the cyber side of the world. You know, from the Exelon point, I've got an entire cyber forensics team that works for me that I say, I've told people are equivalent to what I had working for me at the FBI. They're very, very good at what they do on the forensics side. And we have that across the board. My predecessor did a fantastic job building us really from almost nothing, from square one, and put this together. Why can't we offer that across the country? And so a lot of the big power companies, CEOs through the ESCC get together, they scratch their heads, they say, that's a great idea. Just like we roll out after a hurricane or a natural disaster, we'll roll out after a cyber attack, and we will provide this. It's only been around for about a year. It's been exercised a couple of times. It's not been called to activate into real life situation yet. Knock on wood, it could be this afternoon. You never know. But I cite that as a perfect example of something, an idea that without the CEO's presence, could have easily been put into a subcommittee and a subcommittee and a study group, and it would have been 3, 5, 7 years before anybody worked through getting it done. Now we can actually stand up and make it happen.
Fantastic. All right. And Chris, some thoughts about what's working? Have we covered every successful initiative?
Almost. So I have to echo Siobhan's remarks about, and identify with the difficulty in saying this mouthful about the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center. Is a big success on the financial services side. Just the fact of bringing together financial services firms of that magnitude and the willingness to share, and you're no longer talking about whether we should share. We're just trying to figure out the mechanisms for doing so and where the lines are and that sort of thing. But there's an understanding that we all have to do it, and we have to do it on a sector-wide basis, and then maybe broaden that out to other sectors. So agree with all of that. One of the things that underpins that success is the fact that not only the banks recognizing that we have to share more, but there's a recognition on the government side that they need to do more, right? And again, it's not perfect yet, but the recognition is there, and we're not talking about whether we should, but how we should, which is difficult, right? We're doing new stuff. And so on the moving past information sharing side and into operational collaboration, the government's there for us. We're working through it, working through what linkage is to the intelligence community and to, how we help law enforcement frame which threats they're going after and how we can help each other better understand the systemic threats that are threats not just to the financial services sector, But the same threat actors that might be interested in us are also interested in the electric grid and might also be interested in some of the U.S.'s major industries like the automotive industry. And so there's still a long way to go, but it's a positive sign that the FSARC has multiple contacts throughout the government, and they're working on establishing more of a day-to-day relationship as opposed to a quarterly briefing type of relationship, right? Like moving on from every once in a while interacting and sharing stuff to getting things done on a day-to-day basis.
Please.
Just one thing to add to that, you made an interesting point about stuff coming from the top. When the FSARC was stood up, it was the 8 CEOs of those banks that got together to do it. Because it would not have happened without that, right? Because you have to get that top level down. And we also came to a decision point at one point in time where we had to decide, okay, are we going to do this with or without the government? And the idea was, we're doing it, and you guys are welcome to come along for the ride. And so when standing up, that was one real interesting thing to learn about the partnership, because initially it looked like we were going to go our separate ways, but then because we had that C-suite engagement and it offered them the ability to really hear from these guys, it came back together.
So can I push back, and this is to both of you, what is the role of the government in this discussion? Are they helping to understand the risks systemically that particular banks may not? Are they serving broader coordination issues? Are they giving you cover fire against antitrust? What's the role of government here?
Right, so still working through that, but yes on all of that. There's DHS has a team that looks at risks to critical infrastructure. They're at the table with us. There's various elements of the intelligence community that know things that are, like, the banks have a pretty good view of the threat picture, but we don't have the complete view, and neither does the government, and so there's more of a willingness now to start putting those two views together as soon as you start. And same thing on the law enforcement side, right? The FBI has a very good cyber criminal division, and they're doing a good job taking down the threat actors that are threatening all of us. But the banks are now, the sector is now at the table to help identify which ones are we doing first? What are the, where we have the most impact? And so on all of those things, there's more of a day-to-day interaction, and it gets better every day.
So when we're talking about reducing risk, there's sort of the high-level coordination, and there's some information sharing. But at the end of the day, inside organizations, it involves spending money, changing how we think, investing, serious change. Now, this panel is in a pretty privileged position. You are all in the leadership class. You're in the best of breed for your respective industries. You have leadership, but you also have pretty sufficient resources. As industry leads, how do you think about how to work with your peers who either don't want to invest in these priorities or simply can't because of their size? Now, some of that may be different, right? They won't have the same systemic risk, but they still can affect the overall health of your industries. So how do you think about pushing change across your industries? Whoever wants to jump in.
I think on the FSARC example, I mean, we thought about that very clearly from the get-go as we designed it, as how does all of this work that we're doing with the 8 systemically large, important financial services follow through down to other organizations so that they can actually do something useful with that same information. And as I mentioned, it gets pushed out through the FSISAC. We've also broadened now the membership of the FSARC to allow other firms, there's certain designations required to get in, but as that list gets bigger, more firms collaborate and it gets pushed back out. And I think that's really the opportunity for us to share best practices. And it's not just best practices within industry, it's across borders, it's looking across into power and utility, telco, all the services that we rely on to help them to understand what the threats are and the concerns that we have. Even certain technology firms that everybody relies on, right? They go down, everybody goes down. So how do you mitigate those risks? And that goes much more broadly than just, 1 or 2 institutions.
Maybe just to add a different perspective in the auto industry is an interesting perspective. I think you pointed out in our prep meeting there, our complicated ecosystem, right, and supply chain that we work in. And by the way, I do want to reiterate, I mean, we are very I think everybody sitting up here, I can give a lot of credit to my CEO to recognize the importance of this space, allow us to establish ourselves under this framework, but then really create and I say well-funded and well-resourced organization. And in any group, when you say that, I don't care if you're in private sector or in government, they go, what? Like, no one ever says you have a well-funded and well-resourced organization, and I do. I get everything that I need. I have a large organization. We get the right talent. We can retain the talent. We can do the things we need to do. But in our ecosystem, beyond things like best practices, we work with a bunch of partners that create solutions for us. And when we work with those partners, and those partners can be people that are companies that help us with maybe solutions on the vehicle. They can be telecom partners. We work globally. We have Global OnStar as our telematics solution. We work with almost every telecom provider out there, whether they're the big ones or the mom and pops that have certain areas of the country that they operate within. We drive requirements to them, and we drive requirements to them. We actually pay for that, right? So we pay to have them implement good cybersecurity capability, posture, different controls that we want to put in, whether it's use of digital signatures, whatever it might be, to help protect our ecosystem. But when we do that, if you think about it, that is driven also then through standards organizations. But then at the same time, when they're doing it for us, they don't just do it for us. So when we put in, say, like a break the glass capability, so if you think about our ecosystem, if we have a cyber event that's propagating itself through connected vehicles, one of the first things I have to be able to do is cut all the connections to the vehicle very, very quickly, all my vehicles. When that capability gets driven into our telecom partners, it doesn't just get driven in for us, it actually gets driven in for everybody who's using those telecom partners, because it's capability that's driven in through their platforms. So whether it's, again, on the module side, the system side, or in the telecom side, or even the partners that we use for cloud services, I think we can drive the industry forward that way as well, because they benefit, I think, from those capabilities also.
Yeah, take it a step further. You use the term ecosystem, and I think that's one of those words that I think when we leave here today that everybody should just keep in the back of their head. That is something it's a very apt description. And again, coming from someone relatively new, very new to the position, I've seen it. I've already briefed some of our utility company boards of directors, and in doing those briefings, on some of the cyber threat, and doing the briefings, I learned that if you went and communicated with them in a highly technical realm, which had been done in the past, you got the glazed over look, and you really got nowhere with it. They put somebody like me in who's not going to have the highly technical capability to go in. I've got to convert it into English. I've got to convert it into something that they understand. And we use terms like ecosystem, and suddenly you have not only the board sitting up, but you have the president and the COO and the CFO of those particular utilities sitting up and asking questions all of a sudden. You mean to tell me this or that? I bring in one of our cyber directors, and he gives them the 5-minute scary speech about what is actually happening out there. And then we put it into English for them, and suddenly when they think of it like an ecosystem, how we are procuring goods and services from our company from all sectors. I mean, to keep us going, it has to be there. And suddenly you have business people their job is every day to run the business, not just to protect it, but to run it. And they start to think, well, okay, so that's how it impacts my job every day. Suddenly that tide begins to go, and they begin going down the right road, and which allows us to enhance cybersecurity overall. So ecosystem is a key term.
I will echo that NTIA also really likes the term ecosystem. One, because it is the information ecosystem. It sort of shows the broad scope of what we're talking about. But there are a couple of properties about an ecosystem. It is fractal-like. You can zoom in or out as much as you want, and still you will find that there are these strong interconnections. There's no place where it stops being interconnected. And the other thing is you often don't realize what some of those interconnections are until something gets much bigger or much smaller than it previously was. And that's when you realize, oh, we sort of depended on those links. So it gets quite tricky. Very true. So Chris, any further thoughts on how we can sort of empower inside our own industries as leading companies?
I just say that we always have to recognize that not every bank is a JP Morgan Chase, right? Not every utility has the resources of Exelon. and they're part of the ecosystem also. And it's not helpful to just assume that, that somehow standards and practices that we use at JP Morgan Chase are somehow also relevant all the way down, or no, excuse me, also readily implemented at lesser resource places. And so that is also a problem, and that's one that I think we're only going to solve over time by leading and not necessarily by pushing.
And what does that leadership look like?
Looks like what we're doing. Like, we are taking it seriously. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, all the big banks are putting a lot of money into cybersecurity, and we also feel like we have a responsibility outside of our organizations in the broader ecosystem to push for regulatory alignment and better standards and practices throughout the ecosystem. Like, we're making sure that our networks are secure, but we're also looking to improve the overall ecosystem, so we're not just a fortress inside of a otherwise predatory environment.
And I think the other part of leading that's really important is, so we don't view, and I think that we've talked about this in our discussion as well, General Motors does not view cybersecurity or great cyber capability as a competitive advantage to our competitors. And I think if you view it that way, you approach the problem very differently. If you're viewing it as a competitive advantage, you're trying to prevent others from doing as good as you, as opposed to going into the challenge with trying to bring others along with you, right? Trying to increase capability throughout the ecosystem. I'll use that word again. Throughout the ecosystem, and really, and we talk about it significantly in our tabletop exercises and incident response exercises. If Ford tomorrow or any one of our competitors has a major cyber incident. And I'd probably say it's the same thing with the banks and even the energy sector, although I think that you can't choose your energy company, but you can choose your bank. We can't stand up and go, come buy General Motors products. Say, all of those Fords got hacked, come buy a General Motors product tomorrow, it's gonna be great. If that was a nation state attack, the next day, I am toast, exactly. So that is an impossibility for us, and therefore the importance of it is really make sure that we try to treat this as a community, right, and bring everybody along.
So I'm going to push back across the line because we've painted a very rosy picture so far. And we're going to talk about sort of the broader ecosystem in just a moment. But can we point to areas where we think, from a risk perspective, we're better off than we were 2 years ago? Because essentially, this has been a fairly doom and gloom conference. And I don't want us to walk away saying, you know what, this risk thing, this cyber risk thing, it is in good hands and we're okay. So can we actually point to some real progress where we have reduced risk across our own sectors here?
So I'll take a stab at that first. I think one of the things, and you hit on it too, is just the fact that cyber has been elevated to the board level in most instances. I mean, you can't open the newspaper today without seeing something about a cyber attack somewhere. So it's top of mind. Folks are thinking about it. They're realizing it's an issue. So I think that we are pretty far down the course of realizing cyber is a business risk at this point. And I think that's a pretty significant step, having been in this industry for 20 years, because when we used to say this is going to be a big deal, they'd look at us like we were crazy, right, and said, you guys are out of your mind. Nobody's ever going to have to worry about this. So the fact that boards are recognizing it, paying attention, spending money on it, the fact that there are these different alliances and groups that are being stood up that are sharing information and pushing back into the system, I think it does make a difference in terms of it being harder for the bad guys to come after us. We talked about some of the collaborative stuff we're doing with government. If we put our resources together, I always say, the bad guys pool their resources globally and come at us, and we sit here in these silos and try to respond, although we can't really respond. We just kind of have to take it and shut it down and then let the government respond. So how do you move beyond that, right? How do you get to a point where at least the playing ground seems to be a little bit more fair or level? And I think we're getting there. There's a lot of work still to be done, but I would say compared to where we were 2, even 3 years ago, we've made significant strides.
I think, in going along with the board theme, we present to the board quarterly a heat map that shows, where the cyber threat sits along with all other business threats out there. And they've seen it enough times, and they've said, okay, so it's high and right. It's not in a good place. And so we're going to spend some money and we're going to get this done. And we come back, subsequent meetings, and it's still high and right, and they're saying, what's up with this? And what you have to be able to do is to explain that, look, that threat is evolving on a continuing basis, and it's going to stay high and right most of the time. Now, this, again, coming from a newbie, this theory may be shot down at some point, but my look at it on the prevent, detect, respond, recover continuum, I've told people in my chain, you can spend yourself into oblivion on the prevent side. Now, intelligence and prevention, that's great, but that's a whole lot of bright, shiny objects out there. And one of the things we're trying to do, where I think we've had some success, is talk to our board, educate our board on the detect, especially the respond, recover, to the right of boom, so to speak. As when you look at what are you going to accept, when the attack happens, you have the negative press. It's all over the place. And that's whether or not you immediately went public with it at this moment, or whether you waited 2 months to go public with it. You're going to get about equally the same amount of negative play from the media on that. So the real trick there is, how do you get back on your feet? How do you continue on as a business? What is your sustainability? And so those are the kind of the quiet background things that can be done and to be put in place. And I think we're a little bit in a better place than we were maybe 2 years ago, recognizing that fact that we're still doing everything we can on the prevent side, across the board, trying to maintain the standards there. But at the same time, we're really also not to taking away focus from the respond and recover, because that's when you get knocked down, you got to get back up. You stay on the ground, you're going to die. So you have to get up, you have to move on.
So it's funny that you sort of talked about this, because I did want to highlight that a lot of what we've talked about has been on the respond and recover. And when we are focusing on the identify, prevent, and protect, that's not always in our hands, right? The attack surface isn't necessarily what comes from inside a company, especially as you move further and further away from IT and comms sector and products. So let's cast a wider net. I know we've talked a little bit about that already. What do we seeing from the folks that make and maintain the software on which we depend, in terms of lowering the vulnerability space here and actually making sure that the underlying core product space that we're dependent on isn't continually at risk? And is this something where we need to push a little harder? I'll put Chris on the spot, since he's all the way at the other end.
I want to go first on all the other ones. I'm not sure. So I think that, and I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture by being unnecessarily, I don't want to ruin the doom and gloom theme of the conference, but I think that those things are getting somewhat better also. That problem is recognized. We do a lot of our own in-house, like application development. And yes, that's like a supply chain issue that we're always going to have, but just having the processes and the procedures and the sort of the third-party oversight procedures that are in place now in companies and that are specifically meant to address those sort of cyber risks in the supply chain, I think goes a long way towards making it better. I mean, the problem is recognized, and there are internal controls in place now, at least amongst I'm sure every firm on this stage, to address those. And I think that sort of forces the whole system to improve somewhat from a security side.
And is this something that, it sounds like you're saying this is something that at least your sector is handling by itself, and this is not a space that needs government engagement?
I'll bail you out on that one.
Well, there's a necessary regulation is part of our industry, right? Regulation and supervision is just part of it, and so we support regulation like that. is designed around outcomes, not about, about what the goal should be, not about how to do it. I don't know, Siobhan, what do you?
I think one of the challenges when you're an industry as highly regulated as financial services and you're dependent on technologies that are not regulated at all, it does create a challenge for you, right? Because there's no repercussion or seeming repercussion if something really bad happens over here on something that is a critical dependency to your continuation of being able to operate. So you have to think of it from a risk perspective. There's two options. You either figure out a way to have them share in some of that pain, whether that's through regulation or self-regulation or whatever, or you figure out a way, what's your plan B in the event that something bad happens over here? Do you have a plan B that you can operate on? So I think that there is a lot of discussion going on in government right now about some of these technology infrastructure providers that are being, the question is, should they be classified as critical infrastructure or not because of who depends on them? I mean, everybody up here depends on them. So should they have that same classification and should they be held to the same standards that we are for the same reasons? So I don't know where that's going to net out.
Can I put you on the spot and ask for an opinion?
So, I think from a personal perspective, yes, it makes sense to at least consider the conversation. Right? Does it make sense? I'm not like pro going out and regulating everything because I think that creates other issues. But should there be at least a question about it? Should there be a consideration as to whether they really are critical infrastructure and does that definition hit them in the same way it hits us? Are they systemically important? Because if you look at it from a sort of U.S. industry perspective, if they're systemically important to the economy in the United States continuing to run and operate, then you have to have that conversation.
I want to go back to your original question.
Yeah.
The systems and the software, the things that we use. Yeah, no. I'm sure you're going to ask a regulation question soon, right? We'll have to hit it. Yeah, but no. So I'll say it one more time, our complicated ecosystem, third time's a charge, right? So, we use a lot of different systems and solutions in our vehicles. And I'm going to give an example of like Android Auto. So Android operating system is very prevalent in a vehicle. And if you think about consumer electronics, you buy a new Android phone, you might have it for 2 or 3 years, and then you throw it in the garbage and you get another one. Well, that operating system is created for that device. And once you bring it into a vehicle that now the average age of the vehicle on the road is 11 years and you're seeing them up to 20, 25 years, that whole environment in which they create their software and allow for patch management, create patches, which we don't even control, is a very complicated aspect of things because it's about talking with them about how that model can change or how can we update our vehicles at the same level a phone gets updated every 3 years. And a lot of times there's hardware dependencies there. So it's very interesting. But I think to your point, there's things like that. There's software we develop internally as well. There's software that we work or hardware work with solutions providers on. And we have to, I think, continue to drive that forward because it's really important. But I'm going to pivot your question for a second, too, as well. Because I think...
Let me answer the question that I wish you asked.
Yes, exactly. This is a really good question that you asked. So I think the way in which you can do that, too, though, is working with different entities out there, right? So we've been able to embrace the research community. And the research community is really important to our industry because the research community provides us a lot of input about our systems and our solutions that we didn't even ask for because I'm sorry, yeah.
I just want to say, we mean what we might colloquially refer to as hackers.
Hackers, white hats, yes, thank you. So, we put a welcome mat out to those people and by the way, we develop relationships with them. And if I can hire them, I do. If I can't, then I'll pay them in private contracts to do work for us. The other way in which we do this, I think we can push our teams forward to find things earlier, because you talked about detect and prevent. We're in some discussions with entities of the DoD right now about using red team swapping, so embedding our red team with their red team and vice versa. And really what that does is it brings things to light much earlier in the development process, which then you can learn from and then never make that mistake again, either yourself or with your solutions providers. So I think there's a lot of ways in which you can do the question that you just asked, yes.
And if only once we identified a vulnerability, we never made that same mistake.
Well, and that's you're right, but so the key is I think to check for it early and often, right? You see, and I'm gonna get a little technical, buffer overflows occur all the time. It's the root of many, many embedded systems problems. They are very easy to detect if you're looking for them.
So before we go running into the regulatory solutions, which I know Siobhan's just really excited about, what are some of the other tools that we can imagine that either came out of your industry or that you've seen from other spaces that we can bring together, these other sectors and this, the giant software that is eating the world problem, to make sure that we are getting the security we need, we're getting some of the quality practice and investment we need if we didn't want to go down the regulatory hole? Are there tools, models, either from the government or from the private sector that you think we can push on?
So I would say in the potential context of being slightly controversial, that having a global geopolitical mindset is a tool that is completely underutilized and lost on most people. But that is the greatest potential when you get to the prevent side of things, or even the predict side of things. If you start following what's happening in the world, you can get to a pretty close predictive model of where the bad guys, or who the bad guys are that are gonna come after certain entities. We don't use that because 9 times out of 10, especially when we find we collaborate with certain entities of government, the border stops at the US border, the physical border, right? When we have to explain that we can't shut Germany down and just turn it off and that will not have repercussions throughout the entire system, that's a problem. Like, you can't just do that because our systems are so globally interconnected. So we're agnostic as to where the threat is, where it's coming from. It doesn't matter. What we're trying to look at is how do we use this sort of, if you think of the context of geopolitical risk, cyber threat intelligence, and economic anomalies, you put all of those things together, that gives you a tool. It gives you some pretty interesting observations that you can make to start seeing where things might go wrong. And I think we don't utilize that because there's still very much a mindset that, the border ends here and we can't do that across borders because it's too hard, it's too difficult, information sharing is a nightmare, security clearances are a problem, and multiply that by 100 and however many countries you operate in, the complexity gets out of hand and it becomes too hard to think about. But conversely, when you look at how the bad guys are operating, they are operating that way. So we're never gonna be able to get to any kind of parity with them until we start thinking beyond our own borders.
All right, it is helpful to remember that there are places other than America.
Some of which are nation states that we're
Oh,
all
right.
in, by the way. So, yes, makes it very interesting.
So other thoughts about how we can sort of leverage non-regulatory tools to help foster a more robust and resilient ecosystem, driving a better quality underlying software product?
There's a lot of standards organizations out there, right, that are doing real work. They aren't necessarily just talking about the problem. And I think even the collaboration between, the private sector and the defense community, there are tools, right? There's tools being developed. There's great minds getting together that, I think it's just about raising that level, raising the bar. That's like the entry point of when a solution's developed or software's developed, right? If you kind of take different mindsets, different tactics, put them all together and create a tool chain around that, and you check things against that tool chain, I think it really does have the chance to drive things forward. I know we're active in those spaces, so yeah.
The Department of Commerce believes in standards and that they should be international standards as well.
I think in the energy sector, we're utilizing, again, I mentioned the ESCC earlier, which is the conduit into the government sector. It's where they meet, where they collaborate, and where they can get things done. I think the more you can enhance and show the value of such structures along those lines allows for that, the old biology days, it allows for that petri dish to exist, for things to grow in and prosper, and you get that government industry joint collaborative effort that helps take you across that line where you can't do it all alone. We mentioned, it was mentioned earlier, things stopping at borders. I was old enough I was early in the criminal division of the FBI in the early 90s. The FBI's initial cyber investigative effort was led by one individual who sat 2 desks down from me in the economic crimes unit in the criminal division in 1993. And so they've grown a bit since then, but at that point, we were quickly discovering especially from the fraud, the money laundering end of the world, it wasn't stopping at the border, and the law enforcement was bound by that. So from an industry standpoint, any of those collaborative efforts, such as we're participating in our sector with some success, need to be expanded and continued.
Yep. International, I mean, again, there's more outside of our borders, and there's also more cyber organizations and more sector-based cyber organizations internationally, and just broadening that web and learning to interact with them, you know, the Brits and, you know, around the world, I think also helps improve that's not a regulatory thing, that's just more operational collaboration, information sharing, and those relationships help, and that has nothing to do with regulation.
So we're going to slowly work our way towards this regulatory hill in front of us. And one proposal that we've heard a lot about recently is that the government itself can play a role as a customer. And this doesn't apply primarily to most of your sectors, a little to the auto sector. But certainly the defense industrial base community has worked very hard to say, how can we use the defense acquisition process to push better security practices into the development process. There are a number of bills which I obviously cannot talk about in public on the Hill, but perhaps some of you have some opinions about whether or not this is a promising direction that we should be heading down, of using the government power of the purse strings to help drive investment from the development side.
I'll start.
Okay,
Yeah,
no
I'll
comment.
start.
Yes.
So yeah, I think there's, I might hit two aspects of this. You know, I think the first side of this is, I'm gonna get to your acquisition side too, but if you look at, you know, the things that the Department of Transportation and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration did here a couple years ago, with their, they wrote a series of best practices is what they did. They did it in collaboration with the industry. I think that's a really great regulatory approach. And why I say that is they weren't prescriptive, right? I mean, we know that prescriptive regulation, I think in the area of cybersecurity, would be very challenging, and the amount of time it would take to be enacted, the bad actors would change the way in which they go about things, and it would probably be very limited in its effectiveness. So I think that was a really, really good model, and I think it's a great way in which there can be a regulatory encouragement, I'll use that word, to do the right things in the area of cybersecurity, but without being too prescriptive around that. From the acquisition side, there was a conference here in DC about 3 weeks ago, and if anybody was there, General Motors made a couple of products that we are back in the defense industry visible with a fuel cell-based autonomous vehicle, and then also a ZH2. It's a mid-sized truck that we're working with the Army on. So all that being said, I think in the acquisition process, yes, I think whether that's in that type of acquisition or in government vehicles, it can probably drive the right behavior, the right results, but I think it has to be very careful in how, again, it's constructed, because I think the prescriptive side of this, you know, if you make it so prescriptive, then you're going to design to minimally meet the requirement. And if you design to minimally meet the requirement so that you pass the test, it is likely that that solution probably does not have the best cyber posture.
So I think if you look at it from the can the government do it, the question again is, you know, where are you operating, in what jurisdiction, and where are you going to enforce it? Because I look at it from the context of understanding all of the global frameworks that we have to comply with. If we were to comply with a US government spending regulation, for instance, we're in violation in 130 some other countries, right? So to what end does that actually help? You know, I would flip that and say, looking at understanding and agreeing with your point that you don't want the, you know, the minimum base standard to be the de facto, check the box, you're good enough. How do you encourage different behavior? I think you look at how do you get these global standards somewhat into the realm of agreement, which is a difficult prospect depending on which countries you're operating in. But you need some kind of regulatory harmonization, because when you have multiple countries, especially from large multinational firms, there's a lot more incentive to want to help that than to set a standard in any one specific country that's going to potentially create more work for us on a regulatory compliance side of the house to make sure that we're tracking all of that. I don't know, Chris, you probably same opinion.
I would just echo that. The sort of event-driven urge to regulate applied to a global firm by multiple jurisdictions, it leads quickly to just overlapping, conflicting resource drains. Like we need to harmonize those before we add any more.
I think what we're trying to do is go at it from the just a one bite at a time. How do you eat the elephant type approach? We've spent the last year in Exelon aligning all of our cybersecurity to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Prior to that, because of mergers, acquisitions, as the company grew over the last 5, 7, 8 years, we had a whole lot of different things going in a whole lot of different directions. And I think to our CEO's credit, he just said, stop. What is a guideline? What is a standard that we can go by? And we've taken over 900 different cyber controls to include all our third-party purchasing stuff, and we've aligned them over the last year to the NIST framework. It's a baseline. It's a start. But I would almost be willing to bet, though, there are a lot of companies out there that aren't even close to that and having any kind of baseline. So how do you take on a big challenge like that? You take it one step at a time. And I think that's, as I agree with what the panelists are saying, I'm not sure the government is the answer to that, because it can't be a one-size-fits-all with the diversity that we have across the sectors. But you have to have that awareness within your own organization and to begin to align in some manner, shape, or form with a national standard, and then start from there.
So this may be a tough question for someone who's relatively new in the position.
Definitely.
But is the use of the framework, I completely can understand how it can simplify your internal process controls. Can you share with us how it has also led to a better security decision?
Yeah, I mean, it's from the start, and I don't, obviously in this forum I don't want to go into the details of this, but from the start it quickly identified areas where we needed to remediate, where we weren't aligned with the standards, and you just want to say okay, and then that whole process going back, it's a whole process of having to educate your senior leadership, educate the board of directors that you're going to have to spend some money to get us in compliance. And again, it just gives us a baseline, but it does give us that. It is a platform to stand on. Into my former career in a crisis management situation, when you showed up on the scene, where you had shifting gears here a little bit, but you have a hostage situation. Someone's robbed the First National Bank and they're holding the tellers hostage. You get to the scene, the first thing you want to do is calm everything down, slow everything down. Obviously, you have an immediate crisis response plan, so if something really bad happens, you can respond immediately. But otherwise, time is your friend at that point, and you want to make good decisions, slow it down, put things in place, and work through the crisis. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. We have the emergency response ready to go as best we can, and it gets better every day. But at the same time, we're trying to just align things to have that basis upon which we can stand and build.
I think the other thing the NIST framework does really well, I agree with everything that you just said. I think it also gives you a basis for a risk-based approach.
Yes.
Because to your point about, you go and I get to go to see our board between 4 and 6 times a year, so that's a good opportunity. But I've stopped showing them the heat map because the heat map is never going to change, so that's just a waste of 2 minutes in the slide. Is putting the heat map up and saying, oh yeah, everything is still the same, and the threat bad actors are evolving. So I think from a risk-based approach, you can really identify what are the areas of real importance within your ecosystem. That was the 4th time. I really have to stop this. But you really identify those big risks, and then put the right controls capability in place, right, to protect those. So. I think there's a lot to be said for the NIST framework. I don't think the NIST framework is the answer. I think the NIST framework is the foundation or the starting point.
Good point.
And then you need to build right from there.
So I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience, but we can do a very quick lightning round, which is, again, we've told, I think, a pretty positive story of effective organizational change. There's still a lot of risk out there in the ecosystem. Duck drops.
Yeah, exactly.
So what I'm going to ask is each panelist to identify what is it that you are particularly afraid of the risks that are out there that affect your core business, that your board should be worried about. And if you had a short chance to brief secretary or undersecretary at the government agency of your choice, what's your ask from the government to address this residual risk that's still really affecting your industry? And Chris, can I start with you on the end?
Sure. If I had to just throw out like the threat that concerns us the most, I'd say that it's the systemic threats come from very capable actors, and right now there are not formal norms. You know, there are red lines. They're not really articulated, but they're there. And so the ask at the government level would be to continue to sort of push to formalize some of those red lines and norms internationally. I mean, we have them in other areas of conflict. This is a good place for them also, and so that's my answer.
So if there's anyone doing cyber international relations, you have your next research project.
Very quickly, I would say learn from the lessons of 9/11 and provide an environment in which cross-sector collaboration can not only exist but can be the norm and thrive because of the ecosystems and the interconnection of everything that we do. If we continue working in the silos, we're going down that road again. And an old hero of mine, Harry Truman, said, "The only thing new in this world is history you haven't learned." Think about that for a minute. And that comes from the last president of the United States that didn't have a college degree. So.
And forgive me, Kevin, for jumping in there, but if I was staffing my political at that meeting, I would say, that's great. He's not really asking for anything. Right? We should go to more interagencies. I want to say, what can we, if we want to look for specific things that we can make practice on? If the answer is, this is not the space where the government can push, that's okay.
No, it's a space where the government can assist. I mean, I'm saying the industry, we're the ones, we're smart enough to do this on our own, and we're beginning to. But we need that assistance and that collaboration to get over those humps. The government plays a big role in it. I mean, I readily, if a nation state takes on the power grid, it's not just going to be us. So, and I tell my people that I worry about what I can control and what risks I can reduce. That's the stuff that keeps me awake at night. There's some things that might be beyond my personal level of doing, and it's where I'm going to have that ask of the government to be there when it happens.
So biggest thing that keeps me awake at night is geopolitical instability. So North Korea, South China Seas, East China Seas, all of these big issues that have these forceful impacts on global business. That would be one. The ask that I would say is the United States is in a very unique position to take a global leadership role in this, and we're not doing it. And I would flip the question to say, why the heck are we not taking a leadership position in this? Why are we not trying to really push this forward and bring this to the forefront? Because all of the global industries that sit and operate inside the borders of the United States need that assistance.
Thank you. All right, Jeff?
All right, I'll be really fast. What keeps me up at night is, and what I report out to our board is, the potential for a mass attack on the products in the automotive industry, and that's at any OEM, and the potential implications of such a mass attack. And I think we all face that. But in the auto industry, our systems that contain IP are being attacked every day at the same level that we're seeing probably down the line here. The automotive, the product sector, is not seeing those attacks yet. They're seeing researchers, they're seeing entrepreneurs, they're seeing a bit of hacktivism and maybe some criminalistic behavior, but they aren't seeing nation-state attacks. And the implications of those could be very disturbing. But from what would I ask for is we are a highly regulated industry. And so therefore, in a highly regulated industry, there are previous regulations that may actually, or rules that are out there that may actually be preventing us from securing our ecosystem to the level that we would like to secure our ecosystem. So if I had the opportunity, I would highlight a few of those and ask for some fundamental change in how we're looking at different things so that we can actually protect our customers at the level we need to.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Before we finish, we have a few minutes for questions with the characteristic reminder that a question is usually defined by its relative brevity and its completion with an interrogative punctuation mark. So we have one in the back, and then two over there. Three in the back.
Yes, my question is, I know that we talk public-private partnership, and partnership is not just policy and feedback on the policy. Can you give an example of something that is a true partnership that you've done in your industry with government that has worked both you to them and them to you? And more importantly, do you extend this partnership with foreign governments as well as the United States?
Anyone want to take a quick stab at that?
I'll do the.
I'll go. I still, back to the FSARC, forcing myself to say it's the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center, which is an important part of our ecosystem. I just wanted to touch them all there.
I think we've got bingo in the back.
Well,
that collaboration, even the FSARC is only a year old, but there's already multiple touch points with the government, and we're collaborating on, which crimeware families to go after, say. Like, that's a real ongoing thing. I think our linkages to better understand a threat, which is meaningful to us, right? To know that our view on the threat matches or does not match the government's view. Like, things like that are happening through the FSARC in a way that, and again, for only a year old, I'm impressed with the progress that's being made. I think that's the first part of your question. What was the second?
International. So
Globally.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, the model that we stood up with FSARC, there's 7 other countries interested in doing a similar model of, varying degrees. So, yes, we do work with governments in all of the countries that we operate in. To what extent varies, obviously, with which government we're talking about. But the real challenge is that we still don't have the sort of cross-government piece of it.
Question. See, there was number 2 over here.
Yes, good morning. Thanks a lot for your perfect discussion here. Although I have a question about the level of partnership. Quoting a C member of FireEye, he says, systems are not 100% secure. You have to realize that it's already been breached. In order to establish a decent defense of line defense in depth, you have to do some attribution to the adversaries, and especially the TTPs and the crown jewels that they are after. So my question is this part of information, part of the discussion with the sharing within the partnerships?
How much do we actually use the classic Intel approach when we're thinking about cyber risks that we're dealing with? And is that something of a partnership?
That's the way we talk about it. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, that's convenient. We are using it. Excellent. So in the back.
Hi, my name's Joel Angel. I'm a cyber guy, we'll just say, call sign SCADA hacker. I work for AECOM. I'm going to direct this at finance because this is probably the best broad example on public-private. So obviously we all understand the private, that's you. But the public I'm a little gray on. So most of you have global, except for the energy company, has global footprint. And me being a global assessor and doing cyber implementations globally and working with many of your companies, I noticed that there's a vast difference in standards and regulations, particularly associated with finance, as we move across regions in the country. So convince me why you say you're doing the best thing in the United States when I believe the United States doesn't have the best cyber regulations, particularly in terms of how the regulated industries are being treated, like financial.
So if we're trying to get globally harmonized regulations, do we think that we're going to end up with someone else's regulations, and that's going to really raise the level of security?
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody up here said that the U.S. has the best global cyber regulations. I think we said we had a great example of collaboration, but it's a challenging discussion. And yeah, we are looking at all of the different regulations worldwide to see, you kind of want to take the best parts of all of them and create a superset that creates something that is better than the bottom baseline that, is not going to make anybody more secure, even if they check every single box on that framework.
I agree with that. If you can take the best of everything globally, no organization, I don't think anybody sitting up here, any global organization is going to want to have regional or unique solutions anywhere in the world. They're going to want to have a solution that is the best that they can put out there to protect their customers, albeit I can't use the same cryptology I use here as I do in China because that's not legal. So I have to make my solution possible to be adaptable to the region in which I operate, but that doesn't mean that the methodology in which you implement your solution isn't the same globally, and it should be the best of everything globally.
And just to push on that
Yeah,
a little bit,
sure.
do we have a path to get there? If we don't want a fragmented regulatory model, and we don't want global sync to be a race to the bottom, what's the path look like to get us to both harmonized and more secure?
Well, I would say in our industry, in financial services, I'm optimistic, and I think Chris can weigh in on this as well, that we are getting the discussion started. Exactly. Right? So the challenge is that typically the U.S. wants to push NIST on everybody else and say, go implement this and be done with it. And so there's a lot of realization in our industry that that's probably not the best solution. It may be NIST plus, NIST and some version of something else that's distinct or separate to financial services, but the conversation is starting, and there's a lot of traction and a lot of interest around it.
Yeah, agree. And when you're talking about the differences, and which model is, you don't have to choose which model is best. You just have to agree that even if you have 10 very good models, but there's minor differences between them, like it's still a problem, right? Because the differences in the implementation tend to amplify, when you're talking about a global firm. And you can't take, and as Jeff was saying, you can't take a solution that works here necessarily. Like that makes it, you might have a perfectly elegant solution that works from a technical perspective and is better cybersecurity, but for whatever reason, like the regulatory differences don't allow you to, transport that across the border.
So I think we have time for one last question. Sorry, I'm getting okay, right here. And this is just where the folks standing between you and lunch. Yes.
Well, then I'll keep it long. Good morning, all. I'm John Quigg from the Applied Physics Lab, and thank you for a fascinating panel. I'd like to talk about the difference between a compliance view of cyber risk and the operational existential nature of cyber risk. So after I left the military and Cyber Command, I had a unique opportunity to go do some consulting, and we ran into the "you got that right, Bob" problem, which was where the CIO and the CEO are sitting together with the cyber guy who's talking to them through problems, and the CEO is kind of ignoring it until he realizes it's starting to sound like it might impact the bottom line, and he or she gets a look on his face and goes, "You got that, right, Bob?" to the CIO, who goes, "Yes, I do," and the cyber guy is going, "No, you don't." So that being said, what's the cut line between compliance and the comprehension of existential risk in the boardrooms that you're talking to? And then the second follow-up to that is, how do you see either functions right now that are forcing you to cooperate together holistically across the line to figure those risks that you're getting from third-party SLAs, et cetera? And if there aren't any, what would you see as being opportunities for the government to help you along those lines to open the kimono yourselves and to see where the holes are? Thank you.
Big question, but if we can boil it down.
I'll do very quickly on the cut line. I would say it's evolving. every time we go in with the level of knowledge and experience that the board and the senior leadership have and are gaining. That line's moving a little bit. They understand the risk to the business. They understand what it's going to cost. And you go through a risk value cost algorithm each time this happens. It gets a little easier with the more education and knowledge that they have, but that line is moving on a continuing basis.
I would also say it depends largely on whether you've been breached or are about to be breached. Because if you've been breached, you've been through the reputational damage, and the C-suite understands that it's an ops risk question every time that has a compliance component to it, as opposed to being thought of in the other way. And I think that we really are moving towards that much more, that cyber is just another business risk.
And I would say even the NIST framework helps that, because if you look at in some organizations, cyber might be so buried in the organization, by the time you get that question down to the cyber person, it is a, yes, we got that, or the people above say, yes, we got that, and the cyber guy would be going, we don't have that at all, right? But the cyber person's at the table now, right? And usually the reporting relationship is as such, I can say this in our organization, there is no conflict of interest between business objectives and cyber. It's kind of the cost of doing business, and therefore the right things must be done. But and then I think the other aspect of this is how are you auditing what you're doing? Are you using third parties? You said you were in some consulting work. The use of third parties is really important in the space from my perspective. I spend a lot of money on third parties every year to come in, whether it's capability, red teaming, whatever it might be, because the fox watching the hen house still has a little bit of a bad tendency there, right?
So I think we are out of time. Before I thank the panel, I also want to particularly acknowledge Stephanie Pell from ACI and Christy Rogers from Principal to Principal, who helped us bring everyone together. This really is one of the most elite panels that I've ever had a privilege to moderate, so I'd like to thank you. And I think the ACI folks have something for you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alan, for a great panel, and everyone here for the impact and the ideas on partnership. Thank you.